Hello, hello. Thank you guys for joining me again today. And I apologize so much for the technical difficulties that we had earlier. I think we've got it figured out. So I wanted to come back on and stitch out our Lattice Blossoms block with you. If you haven't seen the workshop from earlier today, you can view that and just kind of fast forward through those the stitching part and then come back and check this one out. And during the workshop, we showed you what our brand new design Lattice Blossoms looks like. And now I'm going to stitch out one of those blocks in the hoop of our embroidery machine. So let's go ahead and get started. First things first, I do want to point out that I have our battleizer product in the hoop right here. This is our batting and stabilizer combination. And this is the only thing I've got in the hoop. This is a great product. You don't need an additional stabilizer with it. It has a lot of movement to it, so if you're stitching out a quilt, it's great for that. It also has the scrim of the stabilizer on the back of it to stand up to any dent stitching that you might see in some designs. So for that very first step, I've got that battleizer in the hoop, and I went ahead and I stitched our placement stitch. You would want to use a water-soluble thread when you're stitching this placement stitch. I have red thread in the needle just so that we can see it on the camera. So I did that, and now we're on step 2. And step 2 is our optional step. Let me see if I can sneak our instructions in here to give you a view of those. All right. So step 2 is our optional step. We notate pretty clearly that it's optional. This is to add the wool batting if you want that additional loft in your quilt. It's great to add. You just cut it to size and press it about 1/4 inch in on the edges to prepare it, and that just helps so that the foot of your machine doesn't get caught in that wool batting. So I'm going to go ahead and skip that for demonstration purposes today. And I would also recommend that you skip that step if you are stitching out Lattice Blossoms to use as a table topper. It's great for wall hangings, just not for table toppers. So now we're moving on to step 3, and you're still going to keep that water-soluble thread in your needle, and this step will sew the placement stitch. So for step 4, we are going to take our square piece of our background fabric, and I will align that in the placement stitching. And I just like to peek underneath the corners to make sure it's nice and centered over those placement stitches, and then still with the water-soluble thread and the needle, we'll sew the tack down. And before we go on to the next step, I'm going to use my hoop scissors, and I am going to trim a scant 1/4 inch on each of these sides. If you use the wool batting, you might not have to trim anything, or you might just have to trim a little less. But one of the great things about quilting in the hoop of your embroidery machine is you don't have to get a perfect 1/4 inch trim away from that basting stitch. It's much more forgiving. All right, so now we are moving on to step 5. And for step 5, I'm going to take my strip of lattice fabric, and I'll place that right side down. My raw edges are approximately going to be even with my background fabric, and then I'll sew my seam using a neutral colored thread. And just for demonstration purposes, again, I've got this red thread in here. Now I'll take my fabric and flip that right side up. And I'm also going to smooth out my fabric and just kind of finger press it so it lays nice and flat. And then still with that neutral thread, we will sew our tack down. Okay, now that we've got our fabric tacked down, I'm going to use our hoop scissors again, and I am going to trim a scant 1/4 inch from the tack down stitching on the inside edges of the block. And you want to make sure you're leaving at least a 1/2 inch of fabric on the outside edges of the block, because you want to have something in your seam allowance for when you're joining your blocks together later. So you can see I've got at least a 1/2 inch, probably more than 1 inch of fabric on those outside edges, and we'll trim that up later when we're done with our block. Now for our next step, it's the same process, that same stitch and flip process. So I'll take my fabric and place it right side down. The raw edges are approximately even with our background fabric, and we'll sew our seam. And then flip our fabric right side up, finger press and smooth out, and sew our tack down. And we're going to use our hoop scissors again, and we are going to trim a scant 1/4 inch along the tack down on those inside edges again. And again, I love this because your trimming doesn't have to be perfect. Just got to be in that ballpark of a scant 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to place my hoop back on the machine. And I'm going to change out my thread for this step because we are on step 9, which will add a little bit of quilting. It's this really, really fun wood grain quilting that you'll see on this lattice. So just change to a thread color of your choice and your needle for this step. Okay, let me show you what this quilting looks like, and then we are going to work on some more of our block. Let me get this out of here. Okay. Hopefully you can see that wood grain quilting and just how fun it is. It adds a really nice mimic of what lattice would really look like. So I'm going to put this back on my machine, And then the next few steps are the same process. So just stitch and flip is what we call it. So we're gonna lay our lattice fabric right side down, and I'm gonna keep that neutral thread in there, and we'll sew the seam. And then we'll flip our fabric right side up, finger press, smooth out, and then with that same thread we can sew our tack down. And I'm just going to trim my strip of lattice fabric so that I have at least a 1/2 inch on the outside edges and that same scant 1/4 inch from the tack down. And then those same steps down here at the bottom of our block as well. Flip that right side up, smooth it out, and then tack it down. Gotta take my hoop off to get that angle. And when you're trimming your fabrics, when they're still in the hoop and you're stitching out your block, it is important that when you're trimming with any of your hoop scissors, you are trimming on a nice hard flat surface, just because you don't want your design and your block to shift while it's in the hoop and things come out of alignment. So step 14 already, we are going to sew that wood grain quilting again. All right, now steps 15 through 18 are the same process, that stitch and flip process, but it's using our triangle pieces of background fabric. So still with a neutral thread in the needle. In this case of my fabrics, it's the same thread. I'm going to lay that piece of triangle fabric right side down. The raw edge is approximately even with my lattice fabric, and we'll sew our seam. And then the same thing for step 16. And the same thing for step 17 and step 18. And then for step 19, you'll want to switch to a water-soluble thread because this step is going to tack down our fabrics on the outside edges of our block. But before we do that, we do want to take each of these corners, flip them right side up, finger press and smooth out. And I would also recommend that for step 19, you slow your machine all the way down. It depends on how slow your machine will go, but just slow it down so it's a little bit easier to manage each of these four corners as you're tacking them down, because this is going to tack down around those edges as well as sew a placement stitch for applique in the future steps. Now that my tack down is done, I'm going to go ahead and speed up my machine for the rest of this step. And this is just sewing the placement stitching for our blossoms that we will place later. Now we are on step 20, and I'm going to place a green thread in the needle. This step will sew the stems of the blossoms. So you can use whatever thread choice you'd like to use, but I'm going to go ahead and use green. right, this step just has a little bit more stitching on the other side of the block, and then we will finish up with adding the applique. Okay, so now we are on step 21. We're getting toward the end of our block. And this uses flower A fabric. So these are smaller pieces of flower fabric. And we're going to tack those down on the two little blossoms right there. And we're going to use a thread that matches our fabric to do that. So let me get that in the needle. All right, and I have my fabric placed. Again, I just like to peek under those edges, make sure it's covering properly. And then with a thread that matches my fabric and the needle, I'll sew my tack down. Okay, now that we've got our fabric tacked down, I'm going to use my Hoop Scissors Mini, this great offset handle, and then a really nice tip on the end. Help me get really nicely in those corners as I'm trimming this, because I want to trim as close to my tack down stitches as possible. And while I'm trimming, again, I'm trimming on a hard, flat surface so that I don't disrupt where my design is in the hoop. Don't want to get anything out of alignment. And I'm also just applying a little bit of light pressure outward on that fabric to get a nice clean cut. So bear with me as I trim this. You can kind of see there about how close I'm getting to that stitching. You want to get as close as you can without nicking it. But when we're tacking down our fabric, if you noticed, it did go around the edges twice, which is really helpful in case you do clip a stitch so that it's still quite secure. Got to keep turning it to get the best angle. Okay, now our fabric is trimmed, and for this next step, we're going to keep the same thread and the needle, and we're going to sew the satin stitch. My machine will come to our other flower and sew that satin stitch over the raw edge as well. Okay, now we're on step 23, and we will tack down our other flower fabric. I believe it's a flower bee fabric. I'm going to change the thread and my needle to a thread that matches my fabric. And then I'll take my piece of flower bee fabric. I'm going to align that over the placement stitch and then sew our tack down. First, I'm going to trim a little piece of thread. Okay, I'm going to leave that same thread in my needle for the next step, but first I'm going to use the hoop scissors mini again and trim as close as I can to that tack down stitching. I love these scissors, especially for this design, so that I can get in those tight corners of the flower as I'm trimming away the fabric. Okay, and now for this next step, we're going to keep that same thread that matches our flower in the needle, and we'll sew our satin stitch. Okay, all of our satin stitching is done for this block, and now we just get to add some fun details. So for step 25, we will switch to a thread that is slightly darker than our flower A fabric, and it will sew some detail. And then step 26, you can change it to one that's another color that coordinates with your flower. But for our demonstration, I'm just going to leave the same thread in my needle for step 25 and 26. All right, and we'll do step 26 and then just a few more steps in this block. I'm going to trim up some threads here. It's so fun how you can play with different threads and colors to really make these details pop on your quilt. I'm going to trim up some threads again. Get this out of my way. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and leave them in the comments as this is finishing up. And I believe what we'll do is we'll answer those tomorrow on our live. And we'll show you this block then as well. Now that we've got all of our technical difficulties, I believe, figured out. Again, we apologize for that earlier. So frustrating when technology doesn't cooperate. I'm going to switch to a lighter thread in my needle. I'm just going to use my thread that matches my flower A fabric. And I believe we've got 3 more steps in this block. So more detail. All right, and I'm going to keep the same thread for this next set of details. But again, I do think it's fun to change it. It adds a lot more depth to your flowers, and it really does look beautiful just using different shades of the same color. Okay, last step. You can use the thread color of your choice for this last step. I'm going to choose a yellow, and I'm just going to put that in the needle, and it will just stitch the center of our flower. Alrighty, so here is my final block. This is block A1. I've got some threads to clean up, but other than that, this block is ready to remove from the hoop and get trimmed with our trimmer by George. Now, I'll do that tomorrow. Aubrey and I will be joining you guys again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we will talk about trimming your blocks to remove the bulk from the seams, as well as joining them together. So join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. See you guys then.